Please welcome to the stage Dr. Jan Mischke.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Also, it's a great pleasure to be here. We have talked a lot this morning about competitiveness and also yesterday. This afternoon will be much more about finance, and I would like to bridge between the two by looking at the link that is investment, which bridges between finance and competitiveness. Why is that so? Commissioner McKinsey earlier asked about a common taxonomy to even understand what competitiveness is. And I would like to offer a very simple one. Just look at investment. That's all it takes. Whatever you do that unleashes investment, either in capital formation or in innovation and R&D, will be good for competitiveness, and the other way around. And when we think about some of the metrics you mentioned on looking at that next amendment and so on, if you just ask yourself that simple question, will it unleash investment or not? Sometimes the answer might be much more simple than our otherwise complex world. Now, why is investment so critical? Actually, we looked at it across the world. It drove about 70 to 80% of productivity growth, 70 to 80% over the last 2 decades. That's how important it was and still is. Let me look at a few facts based on recent research by the McKinsey Global Institute to set up the debate. We're looking at investment and then finance this afternoon. We built a balance sheet of the world, a global balance sheet. And one of the very interesting features in there was that over the last 2 decades, we built $100 trillion of net new capital. And it took us $200 trillion of net new debt to finance that. Now that is interesting, isn't it? So during the time of almost free debt, what happened is that the majority of finance was used to finance either consumption, mostly public consumption, public debt, or to finance asset transactions of existing assets, mostly houses at ever-rising prices, but also corporate bond raises for share buybacks and the like. So this is where we deployed our finance over the last 20 years. And in the process of doing so, we actually created $160 trillion in paper wealth that is not backed by any assets, nor backed by any income streams. That is just a pure valuation gain. Now, if we're sitting on this mountain of a balance sheet with a lot of debt and with stratospheric asset prices, there have been a lot of really negative consequences of the recent inflation, but it might have been a blessing in disguise. But better still than inflating away our balance sheet would be to actually grow our stock of capital and grow our economies. This is what we really need to work on. And this is also what Europe needs to work on. This picture is actually worse in Europe. The ratio here is 3.8 for the UK, 3.9 for Italy. And so-called prudent Germany still has 2.2, which is still worse than the global average, because as prudent as Germany was on the debt side, it was even more stingy on the investment side. So looking at that investment, how is investment fared in Europe? We analyzed 3,000 large corporates, both sides of the Atlantic. Europe has essentially flatlined in constant prices and constant currency terms. The US went through exponential growth. The gap has grown to last year about 700 billion euros. And that number, I think, sounds familiar. It rhymes quite nicely with the recent numbers put out in the Draghi report in terms of what it needs to bring Europe forward. But it's not just any investment. It's energy and technology where the investments are missing. It's energy and technology, and when we think about where Europe's needs are, it's maybe not so surprising. It's not a coincidence where that investment is missing and the state of play we are in Europe on these two matters. So looking more closely at technology, we actually just yesterday published our research on artificial intelligence in Europe. Artificial intelligence will be the defining technology of our generation. By 2030, just in Europe, just with generative AI, there's about 500 billion euros at stake. And that's just the economic side of things. I don't want to even think about what would happen if some region in the world has forms and levels of intelligence that we cannot match. Just think about that. When we looked at where Europe stands, it's very important to not just look at what is the next large language model or whatever is the latest type of your choosing, but to look at the entire value chain, from raw materials all the way to advanced artificial intelligence applications. And when we did that, there is actually one area, it's well known by now, chip machinery, where Europe is really world leading. There's a lot of numbers here on all the other areas, but I can give you the color code. Red means less than 5% global market share. Less than 5% in most parts of that chain. And when we look at it, is that now, should we call it defeat? No, we can and we must still move ahead. But what it requires is tough choices. We cannot win everywhere here. We need to choose our battles wisely. And it needs new thinking, like in chip design and manufacturing. Is it the current technology, or can we leapfrog to the next one? Europe is really good in quantum computing. That's one example of the next generation technology. When we think about cloud infrastructure, there is no room for more than a niche play for European players. Let's face that reality. But the reality is also that Europe currently doesn't have the investments coming in at the scale needed to have enough compute and processing centers and processing power. And what it needs for that, among other things, is 35 gigawatts more of reliable installed capacity of electricity at competitive prices. If we don't fix that, we will not be smart, literally. And then in foundation models and applications, Europe still actually has a reasonably good state of play. But we have to think about, what do the AI Act and 27 more regulations mean if 80% of our surveyed CEOs say, we don't even know what it means for us, let alone that we could handle it. They don't even understand what it means. We also need to think for that about our talent approaches. 30% of top AI talent in Europe move to the US. And it's a one-way street. We don't get the same number coming over here. 30%. So that's another area we need to work on. But across all of that, we also need more money. The investment by the top 4 corporates in the US, announced investment just this year, is 140 billion, compared to 4 billion by the top 3 in Europe. PE and venture capital is a factor 7 to 1 in terms of investment last year. And on the public funding side, it's also a factor 7 to 1, although these are rough estimates and only include the EU and federal level. But roundabout, we are at least a factor 10 off. At least a factor 10 off, and if we don't change that, we will not be in the right position. So bringing it all back to the topic of this afternoon, bringing it all back to finance, what does that mean? If we look at the various financial system elements, we will talk a lot about the banking union. We will talk a lot about the capital markets union, and rightfully so. We must progress on both and either of them. But there's more to it. The vast majority of we've seen on the previous slide of risk capital is supplied by corporates and their cash flows. By far the biggest source of funding. In that environment, can we tolerate that European firms on average have 4 percentage points lower return on invested capital to Europe? And what can be done about it? We heard earlier from Enrico Letta, for instance, the idea that we've also been publishing for many years on the 28th regime that would allow businesses to much easier scale across Europe and consolidate. Could that be one lever to get at this? We also need more risk capital, venture capital. There's a factor of 4x assets under management and venture capital between Europe and the US. And one obvious area would be to start with a very fragmented pension and institutional investor ecosystem, and also revisit the rules, Solvency II and the like, on how they actually can allocate funds. But we also mustn't forget public funding. The reality is Europe has missed the digital wave, mostly, It has mostly missed the software wave. It has mostly missed the internet wave. It doesn't put it exactly into the best spot on the AI wave. So we will need to do an extra effort to actually build the ecosystems that others already have. We will need more public funding, and there's scope. Current public net investment is 1%. 1% of European public expenditure. 99% are for consumption and other purposes. 1% is net investment. So how can we change this bias, and when can we actually bring public accounting standards into the 21st century and put investments on the balance sheet rather than letting them hit the deficits when they occur? With that, thank you very much, and I wish us a very good discussion this afternoon.